Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams. Daniel,
good morning,
nice to see you.
Hi.
Good. Recently, we saw a report come out from our Department of Defense, and it was a catching title, and I'm sure you saw it. They changed their manuals, and they pointed out it now allows for detention of journalists. It sounds rather suspicious. Of course, not too long ago, during the Iraq War, they had this program where they embed journalists. That always bothered me. You know, that has to be control, and if they don't print right, there's going to be problems. But evidently, there's going to be, tightening up on what journalists write, and we certainly have had it from this administration, because after many years laying dormant, our president renewed interest in the Espionage Act. So what do you think is going on here? Is this brand new, or are they passing a new regulation, or are they writing a new law, or why are they able to write this now, and what does it mean?
Well, what these are new guidelines for the Defense Department on how to handle journalists, and especially in the battlefield. And what it is actually is not a new law, but what it is a reinterpretation of existing law. And we were talking about earlier, it reminds me of what John Yoo did, where he reinterpreted the law to allow Bush to torture people. So they're reinterpreting the existing law to say that if a commander in the battlefield views a journalist as being a belligerent, it's vaguely worded, that person can be indefinitely detained by the United States.
Isn't it interesting about the newspeak they use, unprivileged belligerents?
Yes.
These are bad people, and they have to be stopped. But they assured us, I think, in their release, or they're talking about this, is that the military personnel who will be enforcing this will follow the Geneva Convention. Oh, that's nice to know they're following. But they never mention in here that they'd be following the Constitution. And that tells us something, that this looks like more propaganda, control of propaganda. And of course, we know the propaganda, the lies they tell to get us into wars, but then they have to have this ongoing process of making sure that people only hear what our government wants us to hear.
Well, how they present it is, of course, in the most extreme way. They say we have to stop, like the Al-Qaeda magazine, those kinds of journalists who recruit people to Al-Qaeda. They'll give you the most extreme example, and it's easy, I guess, to descend into hyperbole. But if you're a particularly effective critic of one of the Pentagon's wars, or one of the administration's wars, and you are winning hearts and minds to your position, might they not consider that to be a belligerent?
And they more or less try to explain to them that you got to be careful when we're in this serious business, that when journalists come in, they might be, benefiting the other side, because journalists can't be trusted, and they may be plants. Which I'm sure could be true at times, but do you think it ever happens the other way around? I wonder if we might not be the experts on planning journalists. I mean, we have our CIA in so many countries, and we orchestrate overthrow of governments and all these other things. So I think maybe our government actually knows a lot about what goes on when so-called journalists comes into a country.
Well, there's a long and very well documented history of the CIA co-opting journalists and having them wittingly or unwittingly do their bidding. It's from the Cold War on, and I'm sure continuing until the present. There was a former editor of I think it was the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, who said that the CIA regularly planted stories in the European press and pressured them to run certain types of stories over others. And this is recently, so we can assume it goes on.
And it's not hard for them to paint the story that, this is necessary. There are bad people coming in, they're spies, they're part of the war on terrorism, and we got to stop them. But the rule of law is unimportant to them. And it just means that they are going to control things. But it's been going on for so long, it's just a little more blatant right now to write it. And the commander has the decision-making power to do this, and all he has to do is be suspicious. They said he can interpret things broadly on who might be a spy, and if they follow up the rules of the NDAA, they can maybe not just expel them, maybe they can hold them. Who knows? And they don't distinguish between citizens and non-citizens. So it's just more. One lie gets us into a war. They have to tell a lot more to keep the system going.
And that is a good point, because one of the things you mentioned when the NDAA of 2012 came out is that it was so vaguely worded to allow such a broad interpretation. It said, if you're aiding the enemy or associated forces, and that was never defined. And this is the same way. It's very vague, so it allows them to interpret it as broadly as possible. And also, you mentioned indefinite detention, but what about drones, too?
Yeah, right. You know, we picked out a few acts, whether it was NDAA or the Patriot Act, about calling them enabling acts, giving more power to the president. In a way, this enables the government to once again, you know, oppress free speech and this sort of thing, and have more power without the rule of law. But you know, there's a propaganda war going on. Who would have ever guessed, with Russia right now? Who are the good guys and who are the bad guys? And there was an article about Russia that said that the anti-Americanism sentiment in Russia is growing. And I guess we shouldn't be too shocked about that. It's disappointing because it seems like we were doing fairly well after the end of the Cold War, and we were, you know, the winners, and we actually did some trading. Isn't it sort of unbelievable, of all this arguing and fighting and wanting to kill, and then we pay rent for them to get us to our space station? You know, it's really weird how that happens. But anyway, there was a precise incident that occurred earlier this year on none other than Fox News Network, dealing with this incident. And I wanted to read a quote from a general that was on Fox. And the significance of being on Fox is important because it has a big audience. It's a major general. He's significant, and this was broadcast around the world, of course. Now, this is what the general said. It's Major General Scales, and this is in quotes. The only way the United States can have any effect in this region, he's talking about Ukraine, and turn the tide, is to start killing Russians. Killing so many Russians that even Putin's media can't hide the fact that Russians are returning to their motherland in body bags. That's really not offering the idea of friendship to a country. It looks like they want a war. And you know, later on, the general justifies it. He says, we need to send more weapons to Ukraine. And I thought it was interesting. The Russians came back and, of course, dissented from this. But he says, isn't that interesting? The Russians say, isn't this interesting? They said that, you know, they need to kill more Russians. At the same time, the general follows up and saying, you know, our military is falling apart. We need more money. We need to rebuild the military, and it's stretched too far, and they're worn out, which is true. So it sort of contradicts. It was sort of poking fun at the general.
Well, you know, one of the reasons why I wanted to include this in our discussion about unprivileged belligerents is that essentially what this quote-unquote general turned journalist is doing is exactly what the DOD says could result in an indefinite detention, becoming an unprivileged belligerent,
right.
You know, for Russia. But, you know, I think what the general said is, in terms of propaganda, is only an extreme example of the status quo in the mainstream American media, where there really, you know, we have the illusion of a free press, but in reality, on foreign policy, there really is no dissent allowed.
It seems like there's two major groups in the United States who may have thought about Ukraine, well, or even they can address it. One is, it's all Russia's fault, and America didn't do anything. They had nothing to do with the overthrow of the government. And also, most people are still probably apathetic. I imagine there's a large percentage of our high school graduates, maybe college graduates, would have a hard time finding where Ukraine is and the Crimea. I don't think that would be done easily. But unfortunately, the message of non-intervention, of saying that just maybe we bear some responsibilities here. Maybe we do the same things. Maybe we even do it more. And when you see a quote like this, what do you think, or could you postulate on a Russian saying something like this? That what would we probably do?
Can you imagine if a Russian general went on TV and said, we need to start killing so many Americans that they will get out of the Baltics and get out of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that would have stirred up a lot of emotions.
You know what's irritating, I'm sure you feel this irritation too, is when you criticize U.S. involvement in Ukraine, it's written off by your detractors as being pro-Russian. It's not being pro-Russian, it's being anti-U.S. intervention. There's a huge difference. It wouldn't matter where the country is. If the U.S. weren't there, hadn't fomented this coup, then we wouldn't be facing the problems we are. It's not to be pro-Russia at all.
Well, you probably have memories of being on the receiving end of phone calls in the office when I was voting against the wars in the Middle East, especially the Iraq War. They would call, and you'd spend a lot of time on the phone, and I imagine at times you were able to convince them, but there were a lot of calls that I was un-American, didn't support the troops, but finally I sort of won a moral victory on that when they found out that the troops were really still very much with me on being more cautious and not exposing them to a useless, unwinnable, undeclared war where we're still losing people from suicide, 20-some suicides a day from this. So it's a shame that you have victory that way. Why don't we have victories by people saying, how do we go to war? And how are we supposed to do it? Are we supposed to listen to these lies and perpetuate these lies and allow our generals to go on? So this general is a dangerous person to go out and try to be so bombastic, trying to stir up trouble. But what about a network? Don't they have some type of moral responsibility? Sure, we can't close them down. That's the last thing we would do. But where is their sense of responsibility? And I don't see too much there.
You know, this whole thing as we started was about the U.S. war on what they consider to be propagandists. They call them belligerents, and they can be detained. But the U.S. war on propaganda doesn't include the U.S.'s own propaganda. And here's something I wouldn't mind reading quickly here. The U.S. State Department announced the renewal of its crusade against what it called Russian propaganda, okay, heralding the increase in spending on the program, including $500,000 grant to train journalists to fight Moscow's lies in the Baltics. What that means is we go over there, we give a bunch of money to journalists to make sure that they report things the way that the U.S. government wants them reported. That's not free media.
Yeah, and of course we're on the airways all the time. And that's not to say that Russia never does it, but they do it in their own defense as well. But our responsibility, and certainly when I was in office, I saw the responsibility as dealing with U.S. policy and trying to point out the inconsistencies of that. And unfortunately, in this day and age, we live with inconsistencies, we live with abuse of our laws, we go to war in an unconstitutional fashion, and then we punish the people who tell the truth. They lie us into war, and the government's the ones that should be held responsible, but you get a whistleblower and they end up in prison. What a tragedy, because it is true. Truth is treason in an empire lies. So the wars have to be declared based on a lie, and they have to be perpetuated based on lie, and journalists have to be punished. Now this isn't brand new. Lincoln did it, Woodrow Wilson did it, they did it in World War II, but it's different now. It's worse now than ever because we're in perpetual war. And they told us the global war on terrorism is going to last for a long, long time. So therefore, psychologically, they're conditioning us to say, oh, if that's the case, we have to be ready to give up our civil liberties, and that is necessary in order to be safe. We've already seen this expressed in the presidential campaigns when you see a Christie arguing the case that we need the NSA to spy on us because it makes us safe and secure. Now, that's bad news for us, but we have to someday get back to a restricted, limited government and make sure that the government that we elect goes to war only under dire circumstances when war is declared. But this idea that now we have a Bush doctrine that say you don't even need a declaration, that you have to have preemptive war, and that you can go in to stop a war from coming. It's very, very dangerous, and unfortunately, too many Americans are apathetic. So if you want prosperity in this country, you get rid of the wars, because the wars drain us. The cost of the war that has been a total failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, $5 trillion, and it keeps going. And yet here we are looking for a war with a major general arguing the case that we should start killing Russians. We need to wake up and decide that what we want is liberty, we want peace, and we want to bring our troops home. The sooner the better. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Liberty Report, and come back soon.